In the winter of 1971, the Perron family moved to a farmhouse in rural Rhode Island. It was an old place, built in 1736, with more than 14 rooms and surrounded by a vast area of forest. For Roger and Carolyn, the property seemed like the perfect place to raise their 5 daughters. A peaceful refuge away from the hustle and bustle of big cities. However, what they didn't know was that that property held dark secrets, marked by tragedies and horrors that could not be explained. In the early days, the manifestations were subtle, almost harmless. Doors would close secretly, footsteps would sound softly in the hallway during the night, and objects would mysteriously disappear, only to reappear in unusual places. The daughters joked about this, attributing the events to playful ghosts, but soon these occurrences began to frighten them. At night, the girls would report hearing voices coming from the dark, voices calling their names, even though no one was around. One of the daughters, Cindy, began waking up screaming, saying she heard the same phrase over and over, "There are too many bodies buried in the walls."
Carolyn, the family matriarch, was the first to realize that something was very wrong there. While cleaning the house, he found small piles of dirt in the corners of the room. No matter how much I swept, they reappeared the next day, as if they were placed there on purpose. The family's dogs, who were once playful, began to refuse to enter certain rooms in the house, especially the basement. Roger thought it was paranoia, but Carolyn felt like she was constantly being watched, even when she was alone.
The demonstrations became increasingly intense. The nights were interrupted by knocks on the walls and the noise of furniture being dragged. Early one morning, one of the daughters woke up screaming, saying that there was a woman standing next to her bed. She had a horrible face, all wrinkled, and a look that burned like fire, the girl described. Roger searched the house from top to bottom, but found no one. Carolyn began having terrifying dreams about a stern-looking woman in 18th century clothing. She seemed furious, her eyes watching her with hatred. One day, while cleaning the garden, Carolyn came across a stone that looked like an old tombstone. The name engraved on it was Bathsheba Sherman. When she researched the house, she discovered that Bathsheba had lived there in the 19th century. According to local lore, she was accused of being a witch and of sacrificing her own son to the devil. Although she was never officially convicted, Bathsheba's reputation was surrounded by fear and suspicion. After this discovery, things got worse. Carolyn began to feel invisible hands around her neck, squeezing her until she nearly lost consciousness. She also woke up with bruises all over her body, as if she had been held tightly. One night, while investigating noises in the basement, Carolyn was thrown against the wall by an invisible force. She passed out and was only found minutes later, with deep scratch marks on her arms. The demonstrations reached their peak when Carolyn began to act strangely. She would stare into space for hours, mumbling words that no one could understand. Her eyes would become cloudy, as if she were no longer there. Her daughters began to avoid her, afraid of what their mother might do. Desperate, the parents decided to seek help. It was then that Ed and Lorraine Warren, famous paranormal investigators, were called. When Lorraine entered the house, she immediately sensed the presence of something dark. "There is an evil here, something very old and very strong," she told Roger and Carolyn. Lorraine identified Bathsheba as the main entity in the house and stated that she considered the place her territory. Anyone who tried to live there would be punished. During her investigation, Lorraine saw terrifying sights: children crying and screaming, bodies hanging in the barn, and shadowy figures watching from dark corners. Spirit sessions brought up stories of people who had died violently on the property. Lorraine also confirmed that Bathsheba had a direct connection to Carolyn. The witch wanted to take her life, believing she was the rightful owner of the house. In one of the most intense sessions, Carolyn was possessed. Ed and Lorraine reported that she began speaking in an unknown language. Her voice sounded like that of an old man, and her eyes turned white like those of a corpse. Suddenly, she was thrown backwards with such force that she fell unconscious. After the incident, the Warrens recommended that the family leave the house immediately. But that was not easy. Roger explained that financial difficulties prevented them from moving. The Perrons remained in the house for nearly a decade, facing the terror daily. Carolyn avoided the basement, but the manifestations continued in other rooms. Objects flew, doors slammed, and children screamed constantly. When they finally moved out, Carolyn said, "The house never let us out completely. Part of us stayed behind." The property still stands today, and reports of paranormal activity continue to surface. Those who dare to visit describe a heavy atmosphere, as if something or someone was always watching. Many believe that Bathsheba never left, waiting for her next victim. Would you believe this story if it were told by someone else? Or is the truth more terrifying than we imagine? The house is still there, waiting, and the evil that lives within it remains eternal and relentless.